My wife left her phone behind after our daughter-in-law's birthday dinner. 20 minutes later, a security guard pulled me into the surveillance room and said, "Sir, if you don't watch this right now, your wife may not make it through the night." On the screen, I saw the woman I trusted the most, smiling, and the woman I loved the most, being turned into evidence. The irony was this: what saved Catherine's life was not medicine, but the phone she had forgotten. Before this story goes any further, if you feel what I'm about to share is worth hearing, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support helps me keep telling the stories many families choose to keep silent. And it all began that night when I went back to the restaurant just to look for a forgotten phone. I went back to the restaurant to retrieve Catherine's phone with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not because it was expensive, but because my wife never let it out of her reach for more than a few steps. For a concert pianist who once lived by memory and rhythm, that phone had become the last thread keeping her connected to the world as small gaps in her memory began to appear. Scarlett's birthday dinner had just ended, one of those events polished to the point of exhaustion. Warm, golden lights, carefully measured laughter, handshakes colder than the ocean wind outside the Hamptons. I had spent my career as a judge in rooms full of power like that, but that night I felt like a stranger inside my own family. Catherine sat beside me the entire evening, yet somehow felt miles away. She spilled red wine onto the tablecloth twice. The first time, Scarlett gave a thin smile and called it cute. The second time, Mrs. Miller let out a soft sigh, just loud enough for others to hear. Catherine lowered her head to apologize, then misnamed a close friend she had known for over 30 years. I placed my hand over hers. I could feel the tremble she was trying so hard to hide. Sebastian was different. My son barely looked up from his phone, constantly whispering with Scarlett and her parents. I didn't need to hear the words. For months now, they had been playing the same tune. Catherine was no longer clear-minded. Adam was getting too old. The $40 million estate needed to be managed more professionally. The words were wrapped in concern, but underneath was impatience. As dessert was being served, Scarlett leaned toward me, her voice low but sharp. "Dad, I think you should consider a guardianship authorization. Just temporary, for Mom's health." Sebastian's hand settled on his wife's shoulder like a period at the end of the sentence. I looked into my son's eyes. I didn't see worry, only pressure, and the fear of a man buried in debt. Before I could respond, Catherine suddenly gasped. Her hand flew to her chest. The color drained from her face so fast the entire table fell silent. A staff member rushed over. Scarlett stood up immediately. "We need to take her now," she said firmly. "I've already contacted a specialized care facility. They understand this condition better than a public hospital." I objected on instinct. A hospital was the only reasonable choice. But the Miller family closed in at once, each voice different, yet all pointing to the same conclusion. "It's quieter there. Our private doctor is familiar with cases like this. Adam, you're panicking. Let us help." The coordination sent a chill through me. It felt less like concern, and more like a closed-door meeting. In the end, Catherine was taken outside for fresh air. Her breathing eased. She looked at me. Her eyes were cloudy, yet she still tried to smile, as if apologizing for causing trouble. I squeezed her hand, and a dangerous thought crossed my mind. What if I hadn't been there? When everyone finally dispersed, I realized Catherine's phone was missing from her bag. Scarlett said she would have someone look for it and send it later. Sebastian patted my shoulder, told me I should go home and rest. I nodded, but I didn't leave. Instead, I walked back to the front desk and asked for access to the lost and found area. That was when I met Caleb. He was the night security guard with the solid build of a man shaped by discipline. He studied me longer than necessary, then asked quietly, "Sir, are you Catherine's husband?" When I nodded, he gestured for me to follow him, not toward lost property, but down the hallway leading to the surveillance room. "What is this about?" I asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. He opened the door to a room lit only by the pale blue glow of monitors. "I'm not sure I have the right to do this," he said slowly, "but if it were my wife, I'd want to know." He rewound a clip near the bar. I saw Catherine standing there, fumbling for napkins. Then, a familiar hand entered the frame, Scarlett's hand. She leaned in. The movement was quick, precise, so smooth that without slowing it down, no one would notice. Something was poured into Catherine's glass. My stomach tightened. "When was this?" I asked, my voice dry. About 20 minutes before she started struggling to breathe, Caleb replied. In that moment, every scattered piece of the evening crashed together. The pressure, the perfect arrangements, the emptiness in my son's eyes. I stood in that surveillance room surrounded by lifeless screens, and for the first time in my life, I understood the thing that needed protecting most was not my estate, not my family's reputation, but the woman waiting for me outside, completely unaware that her life had just been placed on the table as a bet. I didn't take my eyes off the screen as the video ended. Caleb stood beside me in silence, letting the truth speak for itself. I had lived with evidence for over 40 years on the bench, but never had a single frame felt this heavy. One small motion carried out between music and laughter was enough to turn manufactured concern into a fully formed script. There's one more thing, Caleb said quietly. He bent down and pulled a small recording device from a drawer. This restaurant was once involved in a private lawsuit. We're allowed to screen suspicious items in public areas. This was found in your wife's bag when the staff cleared the table. I looked at the device. My heartbeat slowed by a single beat. It was too small, too discreet, the kind used to capture words when no one is supposed to know. Caleb pressed play. At first the audio was faint. Then it sharpened. Scarlett's voice came through calm, almost cold, as if she were talking about the weather. Just let her mix up a few more names. I need more proof. The doctor already knows what to write in the file. Sebastian replied with a quiet laugh, no hesitation at all. Hurry it up. Dad won't sign anything, but if Mom is declared incapable, everything gets easier. I closed my eyes, not from shock, but to stay upright. I opened them just as another man's voice joined in. I recognized it instantly. Our family's private physician, low, even, like an emotionless guarantee. I only need a few observational reports. The care facility is ready to receive her. Caleb turned the device off. The surveillance room fell so silent I could hear the ocean wind tapping the window. I had seen enough to call my lawyer, enough to contact the police immediately. But Caleb wasn't finished. There's one more clip, he said, switching files. I'm not sure you'll want to hear it. This recording came from another angle, probably a hallway. Footsteps. Then Mrs. Miller's voice, firm and deliberate. What if she slips during the storm? Accidents happen all the time, especially with people who aren't fully aware anymore. Mr. Miller answered, calculating. As long as the paperwork is done before dawn, the blood in my veins went cold. There were no details, no descriptions. Just a thought spoken aloud, and that was enough to expose the line they were willing to cross. I turned to Caleb. You did the right thing, I said quietly. But from this point on, everything has to be clean. He nodded. I've backed up everything. Timestamps, sources, camera angles. If you need me, I'll testify. I stood up. The decision had already formed clear as a verdict written in my mind. I haven't called the police, I said. Not yet. Caleb looked surprised, but he didn't argue. He understood. Sometimes the truth has to be placed just right so there's no way out. I left the restaurant. The salty wind hit my face. Above the Hamptons, the sky hung low, dark clouds rolling in as if waiting for a signal. I called the driver and told him to return to the estate. On the way, I sent Caleb a short message. Keep everything exactly as it is. I'll be in touch. When I got home, Catherine was resting in the bedroom. Her color had improved. She smiled when she saw me, the familiar smile I had loved for 45 years. I worried you, she said, as if it had all been nothing more than a passing wave of fatigue. I sat beside her and took her hand, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart. No, I said. I just needed to be sure you're safe tonight. I stepped into the living room and began working as if preparing for a hearing. First, I checked what they called her supplements. I replaced them with water and sealed the containers carefully. Then I activated the internal security cameras, adding a few angles I had never used before, not to spy but to record. I didn't need a trap. I needed light. My phone buzzed. A message from Scarlett. We're worried about Mom's health. We'll stop by tonight. I read it again, slowly, exactly as expected. Outside, the storm began. Rain tapped steadily against the glass roof like a countdown. Sebastian called next, his concern carefully rehearsed. Dad, are you okay? I'm just worried you're tired. I answered, with the calm I had practiced my entire life. I'm fine. I'm home. I sat down in my familiar chair in the living room, the same one where I had read hundreds of sworn statements. This time there were no attorneys, no jury, just the truth, moving closer by the minute. And as the rain thickened, I understood tonight my family would face something they were not prepared for. A judge with no mercy left, and a trial that could no longer be postponed. The rain grew heavier as the Miller family's car stopped at the gate. Headlights swept across the soaked garden, leaving brief streaks of light, then went dark. I stood in the living room and listened to their footsteps enter, not rushed, not hesitant. People who believe they're in control always walk like that. Scarlett came in first. A dark coat, a face carefully arranged with just enough concern. Her parents followed, polite to the point of coldness. Sebastian was last. His eyes moved across the room like he was taking inventory. I greeted them calmly and invited them to sit, as if this were nothing more than a late-night visit during a storm. "We're very worried about Catherine, Mrs." Miller began setting down her bag. "At the facility, we mentioned they have a specialized team. She's resting," I interrupted gently. "And I've already called a doctor. I didn't say which one. I wanted to see who reacted first." Scarlett shot a quick glance at Sebastian. "Dad, this situation can't be delayed. Mom needs a controlled environment. We're only trying to help." "Help," I repeated, as if noting a legal term. I stood and walked slowly to the table where the documents were waiting. "Then, let's be clear about what you mean by help." Sebastian slid the folder toward me. "It's just a temporary authorization, until Mom gets better." He avoided my eyes, but his hand rested on the pen, a familiar gesture of someone in a hurry. I took the papers and turned each page, reading as carefully as I would in a courtroom. In my mind, I heard Scarlett's voice from the recording. The doctor already knows what to write. I set the papers down. Before I sign, I said I have a few questions. No one objected. They believed questions were harmless formalities. "The care facility you're proposing?" I said. "Who recommended it?" Scarlett answered immediately, too quickly. "Our family's private physician." "Which physician?" I asked. A thin silence passed. "Mrs." Miller stepped in with a tight smile. "Adam, you're being overly cautious." "Caution is a professional habit," I replied, "especially when there's a conflict of interest." Sebastian clenched his jaw. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I looked at my son. "You're making it faster than it should be." The rain slammed against the glass doors. I walked to the control panel and turned on more lights. The living room flooded with brightness. No shadows left. "We'll do this cleanly," I said. "I want to hear it directly from you. Here, now." Scarlett shrugged. "What exactly do you want to hear?" "Why Catherine's medical records changed over the last 3 months," I said. "And why you knew about tonight's breathing episode in advance." The air froze. Sebastian jumped to his feet. "That's a baseless accusation." "I'm asking," I said evenly. "And the answers will find their way." Scarlett laughed this time without hiding it. "Do you think you're still in court? This is family." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "And family needs to make quick decisions." That was when Catherine appeared at the top of the stairs, a light robe around her shoulders, one hand gripping the railing. "Adam." Her voice was weak, but her eyes were unusually clear. I went to her and helped her into a chair. "You're here," I said softly. "Just listen." Scarlett frowned. "She shouldn't be hearing this." "I want to hear," Catherine said calmly. She looked straight at Scarlett. "Go on." A small crack formed in Scarlett's confidence. She turned to Sebastian, searching for support. "I only did what was necessary," she snapped. "If there hadn't been a few reports," I raised my hand. "Thank you." I walked back to the table and picked up the pen. Sebastian exhaled in relief and pushed the papers closer. "Finally. You understand now." I wrote. I didn't sign. I wrote slowly, one word at a time. When I set the pen down, I turned the page toward them. The sentence was clear. "Everything you say is being streamed live to the district attorney's office." Scarlett shot to her feet. "You can't!" I pressed the control. The large screen lit up. Not the cameras in the room, but footage from the restaurant. Caleb stood beside 2 officers, a sealed evidence bag in his hands. The doctor appeared on screen, his face pale. Then the audio played, his voice no longer calm. I was just following instructions. Sebastian stepped back. Mrs. Miller's mouth fell open. Mr. Miller slammed his hand on the table. "You staged this!" he shouted. "I presented it," I replied. "The difference is evidence." Scarlett turned to me, her voice shaking but sharp. "Even so, the estate doesn't belong to you," I said. "Not anymore." I placed another folder on the table. 5 years ago, I transferred the estate into a charitable trust for children. Completely legal, irreversible. Sebastian has no inheritance there. I looked at my son. And you knew that. Sebastian collapsed into his chair. Outside, the rain roared as if sealing the last remaining options. Catherine took my hand. Her grip was warm, steady. "Adam," she said quietly. "I'm okay." Sirens sounded beyond the gate. Red and blue lights washed over the windows. I stood straight, feeling the familiar stillness of a courtroom return. "Tonight," I said, "no one is surprised anymore." The truth arrived right on time. When the door opened, I didn't look at them. I looked at Catherine. The storm was passing, and for the first time in months, I knew I had protected what mattered most, not with power, but with the patience of someone who had watched long enough to act at exactly the right moment. Red and blue lights from the gate flickered across the living room ceiling, pulsing in time with the rain. I didn't need to turn around to know the police had arrived. Caleb had kept his word. He had placed everything into the legal stream where truth carries its own weight. Still, I stood motionless, as if the trial had not truly begun until I struck my own invisible gavel. Scarlett broke the silence. "You're destroying your own family," she said, her voice carefully controlled, all over a few unverified videos. "I'm not destroying anything," I replied. "I'm ending it." I looked straight at her, and I'm not relying on video. I'm relying on words, the words you all just chose to speak. Sebastian stood by the window, his back turned, his shoulders slumped like someone who had just lost a familiar support. "Dad," he said quietly, "can we talk in private?" "We're talking now," I answered. "And this is the safest place to do it because there's nowhere left to hide." A knock sounded at the door, polite and firm. 2 officers entered with Caleb. I nodded to them the way one greets former colleagues. "Thank you for coming at the right time." One officer asked a brief procedural question. I gestured toward the screen, still glowing paused on the image of the sealed evidence bag at the restaurant. "Everything you need has already been transferred," I said. "Timestamps. Sources. Chain of custody." Scarlett let out a hollow laugh. "You really think an old man can build an entire machine like this?" "No," I said. "I just didn't stand in its way." Mrs. Miller stepped forward, her voice urgent. "Adam, we can negotiate." "This will cause a scandal." "Scandal doesn't concern me," I said. "My wife's safety does." Catherine squeezed my hand. The grip was steady, clear, grounded, present. She looked up at Scarlett. "What did you put in my glass?" Catherine asked. No raised voice, no tremor. The question landed in the room like a small stone and sent wide ripples. Scarlett said nothing. Sebastian turned around for the first time, meeting his mother's eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. Be quiet," Catherine said gently but firmly. "I need to hear it from my daughter-in-law." Scarlett exhaled as if tired of the performance. "Just something to help her." "Slow down," she said, "so things would be clearer. Clearer for whom I asked." She glanced at her parents, then looked down. "For us." One officer stepped forward and asked Scarlett to place her hands on the table, following procedure. No one resisted. There was no need. The truth had already done its work. Sebastian collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. "I was in debt," he said, barely above a whisper. "I thought, if it all happened quickly, you thought I cut in, but you didn't ask." I took a breath. "You didn't ask if your mother was afraid. You didn't ask what your father had left to protect besides a stack of papers." I walked to the table and opened the final folder, not to prove, but to end. "The charitable trust," I said slowly. "No one in this room has any claim to the estate. Any attempt to pressure, stage, or falsify was meaningless from the start." I looked at Sebastian. "And you knew that, because you signed as a witness when I created the trust." Sebastian closed his eyes. The truth had nowhere left to go. Caleb received a call, then nodded to the officers. "The doctor has confessed," he said. "Falsified records. Written instructions." Scarlett shook her head. "You've won," she said to me. "What more do you want?" "I want quiet," I replied. "And I want the truth to stay where it is, so no one ever tries to drag it away again." The police asked Scarlett and her parents to come with them to complete the formalities. No handcuffs, no raised voices, just heavy footsteps leaving a room they once believed belonged to them. Before she left, Mrs. Miller turned back, her eyes sharp. "You'll regret this. I've learned to live with discomfort," I said, "but not with lies." The door closed. The rain softened, as if the storm had finished its job. Sebastian remained standing alone in the emptied living room. "Dad," he said, "can I?" "You can go," I said. "And when you're ready to speak the truth, not to trade it for anything, I'll listen." He nodded and left in silence. Only Catherine and I remained. I turned off the screen. The room returned to its warm light. "I'm sorry," I said. The apology came late, but it was real. For not seeing it sooner. Catherine smiled, the smile of someone who knows that delay is sometimes the price of seeing clearly. You saw, she said, and you did the right thing. I opened a window. Cool, salty air flowed in. The storm had retreated, leaving the sea dark, but calm. I realized then that my final trial did not need a loud verdict. It ended with something far simpler, the safety of the woman I love, and the truth placed where it belongs. Not on a judge's bench, but in this house, where it can never be bent again. Morning arrived later than usual, as if the house needed extra time to breathe after a long night. The rain had stopped. Water streaks clung to the glass doors, reflecting a pale gray Hampton sky, quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. I made coffee. The familiar aroma spread through the kitchen, a small ritual to mark that we were still here, and that we had made it through the worst of it. Catherine came down the stairs, slowly but steadily. She paused for a moment, looking around the empty living room, the same space that had been filled with voices and pressure just hours earlier. "Is it over?" she asked. I nodded. "It's over." The days that followed unfolded as a series of necessary steps. Lawyers called. The police checked in. Medical records were reviewed again, this time by independent hands. When the harmful influences were removed, the signs people had once attached to Catherine began to fade. She remembered pieces of music she hadn't touched in years. Some mornings I heard the piano, not perfect but real. The sound filled the house, replacing the fear that had once lived there. Sebastian didn't return. He sent a short message, an apology without excuses. I replied just as briefly that when he was ready to tell the full truth, the door would be open. Not for quick forgiveness, but for a proper beginning if one was still possible. The Miller family appeared in the news in the way they had always feared. Cold headlines about investigations and accountability. I didn't read closely. Some endings don't need attention to know they no longer reach you. A few weeks later, I took Catherine to see a new doctor. He spoke calmly, without judgment. "There's no miracle," he said. "Just this, when the cause is removed, the body has a chance to repair itself." Catherine smiled. I held her hand. Sometimes the greatest healing is simply safety. We decided to sell the estate, not because of painful memories, but because it was time to live lighter. The wide rooms and high ceilings, once needed for gatherings and obligations, had become unnecessary. We found a smaller house by the sea, a place where mornings meant walking on damp sand, and afternoons meant listening to the waves like a steady breath. On moving day, I stood alone for a moment in the old living room. No screens, no documents, just light. I thought about my years on the bench, the long trials, the decisions weighed word by word. I once believed justice lived in the files, but that stormy night taught me something else. In families, justice sometimes begins with staying silent long enough to see clearly, and being brave enough to protect the most vulnerable. The new house has a wooden porch facing the sea. Catherine set her old phone on the table and forgot it there. This time there was nothing to recover. We used it to photograph sunsets, bands of orange and purple melting into the horizon. Each image imperfect and honest. One afternoon, Catherine played a short piece on the piano. I listened without rushing. When she stopped, I applauded. "I still remember," she said with a smile. "These notes." "I remember too," I replied, knowing I meant more than the music. Some people asked if I regretted it not calling the police sooner, letting things go as far as they did. I thought for a moment, then said, "Regret belongs to those who want to go back. I choose to look forward." Not everyone understood. I didn't need them to. We live slowly now. Coffee in the morning, walks in the afternoon, books in the evening. No crowded schedules, no pressure to prove anything. Sometimes letters arrive from the charity, simple notes about new classrooms, about instruments placed into young hands. I fold the letters, place them on the shelf, and feel that things are where they should be. In law, evidence is everything. But in family, truth doesn't live on paper. It lives in how we stand beside each other when everything is shaking. Don't mistake the silence of an old father for weakness. It may be the moment he is watching to protect what is most sacred without noise. Late in the afternoon, we walk hand in hand along the shore. The waves move gently, steady and calm. Catherine rests her head on my shoulder. I look at the sunset, the phone quiet in my pocket, and I know there is nothing left to hide. Only one thing worth keeping. Peace. If this story touched you, please tap like to support it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, and share it with someone you care about. They might need a reminder about kindness and justice in family. Thank you for staying until the end. Your listening is what allows these stories to continue being told.